16, 42.
And I can't count that high. And we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans, it's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just three nerdy veterans geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. Mostly that's Doc, but we just roll with it. But without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Ms. Julia. You do. You have a very pretty face, but we're going to move on and we're going to let Julie introduce herself. So, Julia V, can you tell us, our listeners, who you are?
Hi, I'm Julia V. I'm a science fiction and fantasy writer, and it is my pleasure to be with two friends tonight for a really fun fireside chat.
Well, technically, this was not a fireside chat. This is just an interview, but we've had you on fireside chat, so I get the confusion.
I treat this like, hey, I get to hang out with my two friends, so that's what makes it work for me.
Well, we enjoy having you too. And Doc's like a super fan of the series we're here to talk about, so we'll get into that. But
I've read all part of the introduction. And
like I said, super fan. But so the next part of the introduction, dear listeners, how we first found them. So I don't know about Doc, but I know Julia and I met in 2018 at the Vegas Writers Convention. We were sitting on some of the same panels, so we started talking, and it was just nice to see people that tried to tell military science fiction from slightly different perspectives, so it didn't feel cookie cutter and robotic. Doc and I have talked about that a lot, how some of that mil sci-fi can be same, and you were writing unique perspectives, so it made it fun, which we really liked. But that is not how you met her, Doc, because you weren't in Vegas with us that year. No, I know we called you for bail money and you ignored us.
Yeah, well, I know better than to answer your calls late at night. Hers, yes. Yours, no. Actually, we met when we had her on to talk about the story bundle her book was in.
That's right.
And Kevin J. Anderson, I think, has another story bundle going on right now.
He always has a story bundle. And but yeah, and then we spent some time together also at Dragon Con, which was totally fun. It was wonderful. And then she sent me this book. She goes, "Hey, you sound stressed. Here's a book. Go ahead and read it. Oh, and here's some mooncakes. See, we have matching books."
Cakes?
Yeah, she sent me mooncakes.
Books are nice. Cake is better.
Oh. Well, it was like autumn harvest, and so there's these traditional little cakes that get passed around for family and friends. And Cisca, I know, loves to try new food. Oh yeah, I also sent yarn.
It was like a box of my favorite things.
Yes, so I sent a Vampire Slayer book, some cake, and yarn, because that's how we roll.
It was perfection.
I can't complain about that. Nope. I mean, yarn's not my thing, but food and books, yeah, you got me. So, all right, really Doc. Good. That is good to know. I will try them the next time the opportunity presents. But in the meantime, we're here to let her see if she passes the new religion question. Since she's been on the show before, we had to mix it up a little bit.
Okay, so we have Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers in Space, and Space 1999. Apparently, JR went retro.
I, was all about Battlestar Galactica, but I really like the reboot. I watched the original.
I did too.
I like them both, to be honest. And I thought the reboot, they did a good job of keeping true to certain aspects of it and the spirit and heart within it. So it was really good. So definitely, I think the best choice out of those three options that JR picked.
Yeah, I mean, what I loved about the reboot was it kind of makes that question, what does it mean to be human, right?
Yeah.
The emotions. What does it
mean to be also not just human, but sentient versus does being flesh and bone really matter?
I feel like we're bumping up against all of that right now in science. The things that people are seeing with AI and the things that they're doing with cells, these questions are going to be regular conversational topics at dinner soon.
Very much.
So first, let me enter a correction because I typoed that one. It's actually Buck Rogers in the 25th century, not in space. And one of the things that's actually come up recently, I don't know if you guys follow chess, But the recent grandmaster, one of the grandmasters, was beaten by a young upstart, and so they accused him of cheating by wearing implantable beads. You can look it up if you want to know more. This is a
I
family-friendly
have
show.
heard
We
this
will leave it at
story.
that.
Yes, I've read
And they
this.
said he was getting Morse code from someone who was feeding the opponent's moves into an AI. Now, I think the story is hogwash because the guy was just too quick. But rather than debate that, you can watch all the videos where they break it down. The point is we're at a point where insertable technologies that allow you to communicate are already getting there. You have people that have lost limbs able to move them with rigs like waved to or tied to brain waves. So I mean, I think transhumanism is starting to be now.
Yeah, when you get Ken on here, he makes limbs for a living. He's a prosthetics guy. So like when he comes to talk about book
Nice.
2, I think it'll be, you guys can explore all of that, right? Because like he was a cybernetics major.
Yeah.
So
No.
when we do the transhuman panel, we have to have him. That's what you're saying.
Yes. He did talk about prosthetics at Dragon Con. Like there was a panel about that, I think, for cybernetics. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I know there is. I'm not sure if he was on it. But if he goes to Dragon Con, I know how to get him on that panel.
All right, so I scribbled that down, Doc, but we've got some more religion questions to make it
So draft now for the fantasy ones: Dragon Slayer, Excalibur, or the Last Unicorn.
Ooh, I was always a Dragon Slayer fan, but that was like formative for me. I missed out on the Last Unicorn, so I guess there's a hole in my canon.
So the good news is go ahead, Doc.
There's a neat article on it. I'll have to send it to you where apparently some of the original people from Studio Ghibli, I can never pronounce it, but we're also
Ghibli, I think.
Yeah, we're also involved with the Last Unicorn animation team.
We are big Studio Ghibli fans in my house.
So yeah, you really need to watch it because apparently the company farmed it out to the company that eventually became that studio.
So the good news is your kids are of the right age. You could watch it with them and call it research or bonding or parenting or anything other than embracing your inner child. Because you could do it and be mature. That's my excuse anyway.
I don't know. I mean, the kids, we took them to Disneyland when they were little. Clearly, my husband and I had way more fun than the kids did there. So it was really all about us, even though we said it was for their birthday.
See, I can't even make pretend. I'm just like, no, we're doing it because it makes me happy. So
and because of what she writes, Doc, we added a. Go ahead.
Okay. Ooh, yes. We did a third one. Underworld, Blade, or Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Okay, I love Blade. I mean, I know they're going to reboot it soon, but I'm a big fan of that movie.
Oh no,
and,
Blade's awesome.
Underworld is pretty amazing too. I enjoyed the I don't know. It's just everything about the cinematography on that one was good. It was well done as well. I wasn't as huge a fan on Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, but it wasn't bad. So
I think, when we had our vampire talk and we were talking about vampire movies, I was saying like I just also loved Lost Boys.
Lost Boys is a phenomenal movie. I love it.
Doc was very disappointed she couldn't make that chat.
I was.
Football has taken over her life right now.
Something me, the nerd, geek, and dork, never thought I'd have said about me.
So you need to look him in the eye when you see Viking later and be like, "Foosball is the devil." I have it on good authority. Yeah, all right, Doc.
So, as you know, we love both sci-fi and fantasy, but which was your first love?
It was actually sci-fi because my dad and I watched Star Trek together every night. So
which one?
We watched the original with Captain Kirk, right? Like in Leonard Nimoy.
You were watching it as reruns?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, she was.
You're of an age of the. I know she's not old enough to have watched the originals. I know when I was little, yeah. I mean, I was there when he parted the Red Sea, but that's besides the point.
It was
I do remember watching
forever.
Yeah, it was.
It was in
She said it was in
syndication
syndication
forever.
forever.
It was like
Oh,
at
yeah.
5 p.m. or 5:30, so you could just like eat dinner and watch Star Trek.
I mean, that's
Yeah, I
kind
like
of the
the
best
Next
way to do dinner.
Generation.
I missed
I mean, who?
TNG. So like I basically went from Star Trek the original to all of a sudden watching the one with Captain Janeway, Voyager.
Voyager.
Yeah. So my husband and I always watched Voyager and we loved it. But I missed like The Next Generation, Babylon 5, like the ones in the middle.
Babylon 5.
Okay. Well, now you've got projects. You can go back and rewatch them.
So, I mean, we can totally do a Babylon 5 episode, though.
We actually have that on the list, Doc. We were going to get together. There's even some authors that have written in those franchises that we can have to come on and nerd out over it that we know. I know, like Kristen Catherine Rush has written some Star Trek stuff, and her husband Dean Wesley. No,
Yeah, Dean
Smith?
Wesley Smith. Yeah, we were
Oh,
having
there we go.
dinner when I was at the anthology workshop this summer, and Dean talked about that experience of writing and that franchise, and just the fact that there's such super fans, right, for that.
They are. Babylon 5 is not Star Trek.
I mean, if you know the history of the creation of Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine, you could argue that it's off canon Star Trek.
It is not.
Or maybe Star Trek was off canon Babylon 5.
It is way too gritty.
Well, either way, that sounds like a discussion for a panel we will have to schedule. But in the meantime,
ask your question, JR,
we're here
before I hurt you.
So, what was your first memory of engaging in speculative fiction? Was it watching Star Trek with your dad, or was there something before that?
Well, before that, my dad was like quite a storyteller. So when I was a kid and, I wanted a bedtime story, he would tell me these wuxia stories. But back then I didn't know they were wuxia. I just thought they were stories. So I didn't know they were martial arts, fantasy type stories like xianxia or wuxia. Instead, I just thought like that's what bedtime stories were, that there were these heroic feats, with this, kind of really kind of supernatural elements to them, and that's how I grew up, right? I think even now, like my dad and I have talked about that kind of fiction, and as a kid, I'm not even sure I thought it was fiction. Like I might have thought that those things actually happened, and these were just my dad's anecdotes that he was recounting to me.
I think it's kind of cool that your first exposure was oral history, because that's kind of where all storytelling starts, and it's as old as man. I mean,
we're all parents here, so our kids, I'm sure, there were times we had to tell them a story and we didn't have a book with us, so we had to like go free form, right?
So my stories were something a little bit closer to what you saw if you watched the movie Major Payne, The Little Engine That Could. You should watch that movie with your boys. It's iconic. It's a classic comedy military adventure. But so how did your love of what is it you love about speculative tale is all this time, really, Doc? What is it about speculative fiction that you love?
I think that we're tied to this world with our five senses, right? But the otherworldly, or sort of the magical element or supernatural, is always really interesting to me. It's the same way. I think there's sort of this universal appeal of a portal fantasy, right? Going somewhere where special things happen, like Narnia. So I've always liked those types of stories.
Okay, I get that. So when you were watching those stories as kids, or listening to your dad tell you them at bedtime, did you ever like imagine yourself in those worlds and carry the stories on when the story officially ended?
That's a really good question, and I think it didn't happen until later. Like when I was in elementary school, there was a book I checked out of the school library over and over again, and I wanted to be that character. It was a doll who went on an adventure, right? So it was like this big picture book where this doll went on a magical adventure with like seagulls and castles and whatever. And I probably filled up the card on the front of that book because I checked it out all the time and I wanted that adventure for myself. Like, so that would probably be the first time where I saw myself in a story.
Okay. So did you ever get that book for your kids when they were of appropriate ages so they could experience it?
No, with my sons, they had different kinds of taste, right? And I would say my
Yeah.
older one loved Harry Potter and like Thomas, like the Choo Choo Train type stories when he was little. My younger one now, we're doing some Rick Riordan stories, so
Oh,
I'm
Oh,
that's
enjoying
a
good.
good
those
one.
too.
Rick's got some good ones. We should invite him on the show. I don't know. That might be a big ask for us, but you know what? I'm going to reach out. Worst
You
they could
know,
tell me is
yeah, I mean, I love middle grade, and I think Rick Riordan's doing these amazing things with his imprints, where he's bringing on more voices to his Hyperion or whoever the publisher
Yeah.
is. Yeah, so I think it's awesome.
so. How did your love of speculative fiction as a genre and listening to those stories and reading those stories transition into you deciding to tell your own stories and write them down?
I know a lot of people say that they were always a writer, and I feel like that was for sure my story. I was always a writer. I was the kid in class with like a notebook and like stacks of books, and I just love to read and I love to tell stories. But it became a real thing, and with my co-author Ken, when we were about 12 or 13. So now I'm dating myself. I'm going to explain that we were co-writing a story and we would exchange it on a 5 1/4 floppy. So we were typing these stories at home on our little PCs and then like sharing a floppy drive and a floppy disk, and then he would print them, and like he had a daisy wheel printer. So you can imagine it sounded like thunder in his house like at night
I've heard
putting
those.
our stories.
I, it's cool that your parents sort of indulged that because they could have complained about the cost of ink and paper.
They could have. I mean, it was the kind of paper where it had little holes and like it
Oh,
needed a
I
different
remember
track
this.
speed.
I do too. So, is there any chance the world will see that story you two first created together?
Oh my God, no. It was terrible. Like I have it on I have it in a box and I was like, wow. I mean, you could see our early love of fantasy, right? Because it's a Merlin-based story. So clearly, even then, we really loved sort of the magic angle and magic users, and that was exciting to us. But we were also very prolific. Like we wrote very long stories for 14-year-olds.
One of these days, we'll have to have you both on the show, and we can talk about the origin story of you guys as co-writers, because I feel like that development would be entertaining to hear when both of you are on. So we'll have to make that happen.
Yeah, we always joke like together we're like one brain. So it's working out for us.
It would
Yeah,
work. And with his background in prosthetics, it might be plausible.
Yeah, and sometimes I will write a scene that is like too scary for me and I can't finish, and he will come and like he's got much more of like a horror bent. Like I think we both like fantasy, but his overlap for horror and dark fantasy is like bigger, and so it works well because then that way the whole piece has a bigger range of things for the reader.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I can see the horror element in one of the creatures. Definitely.
So,
No lie. I turned on the light.
so many authors will let their own real life experiences sort of influence the stories they tell. So, were there any specific formidable moments that shape you as a storyteller?
I think, culturally, food is important to me. So when I write, it's inevitable that food will end up in the stories, even when it's a short story. But more that my life experiences as a as a trial lawyer, I try to keep that out of my books. But here's where it shows up. If you're making a deal with the Fae, right? And you're bargaining, I find that my work skills tend to be useful in writing those sections.
I can totally see that.
Oh, yeah. So, do you use them for the good side of the good or the side of the fae?
I think just about being super specific, right? The English language is so amazing. We have so many words to narrow down exactly what we mean and what circumstances things should apply to. And since the Fae have that, I think that tricksy bent, where they're always looking for some kind of loophole, right? That's what I use my daily training for, to try and imagine, okay, well, how can I close this loop or leave one for a story premise for later?
Okay. So I did realize, as I said that question, that I just automatically assumed by default the Fae were evil. And I wonder how much of that is culturally with the stories I grew up with. So do you think Fae, when you're writing them in this, are inherently sort of that evil, trickster, chaotic kind of thing? Or do you envision them when you write as something a little just more wild, but not inherently bad?
I think that for us, I don't, in our world, we don't consider them evil or good, right? They have a range of emotions. They have alliances, right? So they have loyalties that may be different because they're not human, and their rules are different, right? So, but they can coexist in this world that we wrote, and so it's where I think where the book gets interesting is where they would diverge, right? When their interests don't align with yours. And this is when you start to see, okay, they have different values than we have, right? And that's when things get interesting.
So I grew up. My grandmother is half German, so she grew up where that was her first language. And so, you get the Brothers Grimm, but they weren't always so Disney-esque when they first came out. There were some dark stories, and that's the version she told us when we were little. So you better be good or else.
No wonder you're
Like,
the way you are.
it all makes sense now, come to think of it. So before this becomes the JR therapy hour, why don't you ask the next question?
So transitioning into some of the fun fandom stuff. Have you had anybody cosplay a character or fan art yet?
No, we're we're so excited though. I mean, okay, so Christian Benjamin did our cover for us, and I ended up finding another artist on Fiverr to do like the character art so we can make tchotchkes and things like that for our fans. But I mean, for me, the visualization aspect of having another artist do your work is so magical, right? Because you're seeing them in your head, and like Roxy is somewhat iconic, right? She's got these hammers, right, that are sharpened into stakes at the end, and the way she sees her magic and her relationship to the world is also very literal, right? She's a breaker, and she breaks things. So I look forward to when more readers like actually can see themselves as like someone like Roxy, right?
Yeah.
And I told you this before when we were doing cover research, we noticed that a lot of urban fantasy heroines wear black leather jackets. So that was a decision we consciously made that she wasn't going to do that.
I loved it reading it and having done some stuff with cosplay. She's distinctive. Like you look at her and I've looked at authors and they're like, well, what do you mean by a physical description? I'm like, if somebody walked past you dressed as your character, how would you know that was your character and not Harry Dresden or Anita Blake? And they're like, who they're great characters. I'm not knocking them, but how would you know that? And Roxy is very distinctive. She's always got the hammers. She has not a black trench coat. She has other things I'm not going to go into because some plots in there.
Yeah,
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
not to give away stuff, but later she gets even more distinctive stuff because of
I love
what
it.
happens. Yeah.
I love it because it's definitely one where I could picture her and I know exactly what she would look like if she walked right in front of me.
I actually have a family friend, she's a model, and, my family members are like, "You have to hire her to cosplay your character because she's perfectly Roxy," and I was like, "Oh my god." So we joked about that. I was like, "Okay, well, if I ever do, like, Comic-Con and I get a booth, like, I'm bringing this model with me."
Hey, it could work.
See, this is one of those things where we don't have to. This is for you, dear listener. We don't actually have to have read the author's work to do the interview, and we can still have fun and learn about the books. And a lot of times, Doc and I end up buying the books because we have problems. But this is one of the ones where it gets a little different because you've read all of the books, Doc. So when you get a little giddy, it's kind of fun to watch. But
so, but if you are a cosplayer or a art I'm sure Julia has a way for you to reach out and get her, like, show her what you've done, right? And you can put it in your newsletter.
Yes, we do have a newsletter, and also we have a Facebook group, and I'm also unfortunately probably on Facebook too much, but that is a good way to get a hold of me, or just even like tweet me. So
I think it's great. Lord knows, I saw the picture of your dog looking very worried, and I'm like, he's worried because he's worried what you're going to do to her next.
My dog is tragic, though. I mean, I should get one with the pose like this, they like cover their head.
So I will get the newsletter link and the Facebook group link, because that is not one of the links I have, dear listener, and we will throw that in the show notes, so that way, if you so desire, you can check that out and join those groups.
So has anyone asked for your autograph in public?
When I was at Superstars, I was in an anthology there, so it was very fun signing my name. I mean, I guess I hadn't thought about it before, but I've noticed that certain authors have like favorite pens, even.
I could see that. So, did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience, because when you're writing, it's kind of solitary, like you're on your own making art, making a story, and then you forget, like, it's out there in the world, and that's who you're doing it for, right? You're doing it for the readers. So when they come back to you and they're like, "Hey, will you sign this?" It's like, "Oh, why yes, I will."
I think it's great. I love it. That author.
If someone gets excited by Doc squeeing out over your book and they're like, you know what, I really want to read this, and then they get hooked and they want a signed copy, is there any way through your website where they can reach out and like, hey, how do I buy a signed copy from you?
Yeah, we're going to integrate that, so that, in fact, I was thinking about doing it after Halloween, so that we could put it in our newsletter if people wanted to give signed copies for Christmas, because we do have a way to do direct sales, because that's how we're selling 1.5, right? So I think it'll be easy for us, at least for North American. I can't guarantee that we could do that for international.
I will say that your website is gorgeous, and it made me realize that mine still looks like the 1990s called, and they want it back. So I'm probably going to have to do mine now, and it's all your fault.
No,
is it because
your website looks amazing? I still have the WordPress template that I got back in 2016. I just never changed it.
I can't take credit. I work with Nate Hofelder from Digital Reader, and Nate is just a genius, and he takes care of things when I have questions.
That
it looks amazing. You did well.
So, but we're gonna get back to some of those. Have you spotted one of your books out in the wild yet?
No, but I'm living for that moment, right? Like, for me to be on a train and to just see like some reader holding it up, I mean, because when I'm on the airplane, I always look to see what people are reading. Don't you do that? Like, oh, what? Of
course. They might have a good book. So, what is your weirdest or funniest fan interaction?
I was telling JR earlier that most of the interactions I have with readers is they really want to know about the how to get a book published. Like that, I think everyone has a book inside of them that they want to write. And so the most normal experiences have been, they've been asking about what to do for their book. The only one that was a little bit funny was, I'm trying to gauge where they are in their publication journey. And it turned out they hadn't written their book yet. So I was like, okay, maybe you don't need to worry about this until you finish your book. And
yeah, that helps.
Like how we were at Dragon Con and we were headed out to dinner. So we took an Uber, and the Uber driver said, "Oh, you're all authors? Like, I want to write a book." And so we had this amazing discussion in the Uber ride about, publishing and getting your words out there into the world. It's easier than ever in some ways, right? Because of the tools. But in other ways, it's a lot harder to find your audience because there are so many more books.
Yes.
Oh, yes, there are. So this is the part of the introduction of the interview where we get to ask Julia what she has written. So can you give us the Reader's Digest version of your body of work?
So Ken and I started out in military sci-fi, and we wrote near future. It was really for us a really fun adventure because we loved the movies. Aliens was sort of our tribute to Aliens. We were like, okay, let's do. I think we thought we would write one book, and that ended up being like, I don't know, 300,000 words in that world before we were finished with it. And so then we asked each other, well, what else are we reading? What should we write next? And we realized we were both reading so much contemporary fantasy. Like we loved urban fantasy. Ken's a huge fan of the Harry Dresden books, and I loved like Faith Hunter, and I loved Alona Andrews, like the Kate Daniels books. So we talked about our love of those things, and we said, okay, well, obviously we're big fans of like the, person with magic or girl with sword, but can we also make it a little more exciting for us by having some Asian elements, like Asian monsters and some Asian elements of magic in there? And so that brought up a lot of world building for us, and that kind of branched into what we were doing now with our West Coast series with Seattle Slayers. And then we sold a trilogy to Tor, which we have publication date now. So, so book one, Ebony Gate, will be out July 11th in 2023, and it's very exciting because I got to see the ARC today, like the ARC copy, and so it started to feel real.
Nice.
So is the trilogy sold to Tor in the same universe as the Seattle Slayers, or are they separate?
No, it's a different universe, but I think our desire for writing and putting certain stories out in the world came from the same place. We wrote Ebony Gate first. We wrote 1 and 2 in that trilogy before we sold it. And then after we sold it, we said, okay, well, we should do something fun for ourselves. And this has a more dystopian feel, which is different. Like Ebony Gate, one of the charms of it is this magical Chinatown that is kind of like Diagon Alley, but it's all Chinese anyway. So that was one aspect, because it's set in San Francisco and I grew up there. So it has a lot more of a modern feel to it. Whereas Stakes and Bones, it kind of has that like veil where, yes, it's modern life, but so many fantastical things are happening because of magic that it blurs that line a little bit more.
Yeah, well, and it says in the book that it's 100 years after whatever happened to Seattle to bring magic to it.
Yeah, there's been 100 years since the veil went up, right? Which kind of divides the United States, right? So it changes lives for Americans, so that you have this set that lives right here in the West Coast where there's magic everywhere, and it's sort of like tech doesn't work, right?
Yeah. So I thought it was really good. I liked it. It's kind of a world where you can have one or the other, but you're left kind of like, okay, you can have one or the other, but you can't really have both very well.
Yeah, and it does make you wonder, like, what would you pick, right? If you could have this, would you give up all the other things?
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a great series.
Thank you. We're
Well,
excited.
before we dive into that, before we dive into the Seattle Slayers, let's just go ahead and pause while we shamelessly shill for the man now, and then we don't have to interrupt the fun fest for Doc.
In a world where magic is controlled by law and government, mages are both coddled and persecuted. Corey Monroe knows she isn't a mage, and her best friend is. Reality isn't always what you know. If you are looking for an urban fantasy with found family, an education-based magic system, and evolving storylines, try My Luck by Mel Todd, book 1 in the Twisted Luck series, available exclusively on Amazon.
All right, so you gave us the highlight of your body of work, but so we're going to talk specifically about the Stakes and Bones, which is the book 1 of the Seattle Slayers. So how did you come up with the premise for this universe? Like, where did the idea for the series come from?
Strangely, it came from like reading some news report about how earthquakes would reshape the West Coast, and then I started to think about other supernatural events that could change the way life was for people who lived out here. And then I started to just think, well, what if we didn't have kind of the normal events like sunrise in the morning? Like the sun is rising, but what if you can't see it? What if it's covered, right? Like, and part of this was because we were having wildfires, really bad wildfires in 2020 here in California. And so we were having power outages and wildfires. And I think that did lend itself to this sort of dystopian feel, right? When we looked out and the sky was orange every day, it was crazy. So that started to make me think, and I don't know why, but immediately I was like, well, what if you were a vampire and you could walk out in the daylight because the sun isn't burning your skin, you know? So it's kind of like Blade, but not Blade, right?
Yeah.
Meaning in Blade,
Okay.
he has a special gift because he's a day walker, but in ours, it's like any vampire could be walking out in the day because the sun's not burning them.
Yeah. What do you think?
Okay, I'll take it. No, that sounds interesting. So normally I'm all about the pew pew, but this one sounds interesting enough. I might have to check it out over on the ebook. But before we dig into the specifics of the characters in the series, we're going to take a look at this glorious cover, and you can tell us the story behind it because Doc was swooning over that art.
Oh, so when I was working with Christian Bensalon, he is such a gifted artist, right? And he loves dystopian backgrounds. And we were like, Christian, we have the perfect project for you. Can you make us like a wrecked landscape for Seattle? And then we told him about Roxy and how she's a very powerful person, right? And her role in this book is pretty physical, and she carries these hammers. And so this is why you see her standing there on the rubble, and she's got this lighting behind her, because when we talked about like, what does it look like in the twilight, we realized, well, it's really going to look like that moment before sunset, right? Where it like all the shades are getting a little bit darker, but you can still see. And so that's what Christian did for us. And he's really amazing.
He is. I've worked with him, and he when he was first starting out, he was testing his skills, making memes, and it was pretty funny because language barrier was slightly in the beginning worse, and so some of the results were hilarious. And then when people would explain it to him, it was even more funny because then he was doing it on purpose for a while. So it was fun to watch him troll some people in the beginning. This was a couple years ago at this point, but so you lucked out with him as your artist. He's got skills.
We had lucked out because he came in our series, our military sci-fi series, and he did the second cover for us because our artist had gotten ill for the first cover. So she gave us all the source files and she gave us some recommendations, and Christian was on the list. So we worked with him and he did a phenomenal job. And so we knew that he was really our guy.
You can't go wrong with his work. Is amazing. And as you can see, dear listener, you can check it out for yourself. All right, Doc. The next one is you. I will shut up and let you do your part.
So give the 30-second elevator pitch for your book.
In some ways, I know this is going to sound strange. I think of it as like the same journey as Luke Skywalker's, except that with magic and, in a dystopian Seattle. But in the end, the story is about, is this woman going to become someone who follows in her father's footsteps, right? And what does that mean for her? So it's about a journey of self-discovery and learning, how resilient you can be in the face of great odds, right?
And so
that's a very good answer.
It is a very good answer, and it's a very quick answer, which is great. Because sometimes I'm like, okay, that was like a 10-minute.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we were like, okay, in the end, when we were done writing, we're like, what is this story really about? And I said, okay, it's about, she wants to know, is she going to be a breaker like her father? Is she going to be someone who can topple cities? And what is going to happen along the way? Like her alliances, her friendships, she's really going to figure out who she is, right? And what she's willing to do for people.
So JR loves to ask what makes this series special. And I really think you have to answer this because I can come up with tons of answers because I've read.
I've heard the question asked as like, why this book or why this person
Well, I
at
think
this
it's
time?
like what makes it urban fantasy. There's a lot of urban fantasy, but what is it that makes yours like this specific one? This is niche. This is totally unique that I bring to the table.
It had to be us, I think, because of Ken and I having that diaspora experience of growing up here on the West Coast, but also having heavy Asian influence in our lives, right? So we wanted to be able to bring sort of like these Asian monsters and, you know, get it out of anime and into literature for the reader. So this is very special to us to be able to do that. And also, when I think about our joint writing experiences, because when I'm left to my own devices, I think the pacing of my stories is a little bit different, but like Ken is like a really action-oriented kind of writer. And so the two of us, we get this big range we can give the reader, right? Where there's the interior life of the character, and then of course these like top-notch action scenes and these hand-to-hand like fight scenes and like these life and death harrowing scenes and like the really gory monster scenes, they're all in there.
Oh, it's definitely a complete package, and I think also, and because as you said, you know, your first generation, there's that also the different culture, because the world from going to the Vale and before, because where she's originally from is a world that's not in the Vale, is a place not in the Vale. It's a very different culture. And you had to straddle both of those growing up.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And I think that
most of us, you know, understand that we're always trying to figure out like where we fit in, whether it's a new job, a new school, a new city. We've all had that experience. And then when you have that kind of culture gap with your own parents too, right? Where your parents are grew up in another country and then, you know, you're all trying to make a new life somewhere. I think those struggles and things are something I wanted to capture in this book, but I didn't need to make it political. I could just talk about it in the sense that this is a fantasy,
well,
right?
yeah.
He's crossed into a magical realm, and like that means everyone there is like
Well,
kind of, you know, in equal footing as far as how unsettling it is for
what
them.
I also really loved is being somebody who's comes from a family of military vets and being a veteran, is there's also that aspect where she's talking about her experiences with her dad, and she's like, I didn't get it until I got here, because her dad, having been a slayer, is essentially a veteran in many ways because of the combat experiences and the the quirks that come from putting your life in harmful situations. Um, so I thought that was really great also that you touched on that, because there is that kind of disconnect between generations.
Sorry, that was my kid coming to get his homework and sneak it back out.
Oh, you know what? At least your kids are not hitting you up for food.
That's because I
So,
like
Doc,
made a pot of soup earlier, so it's like,
I know. I
hey,
saw
start
the
with the
picture
soup.
of that soup and it looked so good.
The ratio of
so
cheese definitely affects like it's like I think high score with the family.
cheese makes everything better. And no, I'm not from Wisconsin, but so Doc mentioned the angle of the dad's combat experience as a destroyer. I think she called it, right, Doc?
Break.
Yeah, he's a
Was it
breaker.
breaker? So was that intentional to cover sort of that effect? Because I do notice some authors, when they write people that have experienced that combat, it's like, yep, that was Tuesday, moving on. And I'm like, you do realize you just wrote a sociopath, because nobody can do that and not have it affect them unless they have like something seriously broken in their head.
Yeah, I think that is something that carried over from the military sci-fi writing, right? To recognize that when people have these life experiences and these events that are actually quite traumatic, it doesn't just go away. Like you said, it's not just Tuesday and then, tomorrow is something different and easy to accomplish. It's that everyone needs new coping mechanisms, right, to reconcile what life is like.
Yeah. All right, Doc, now that I've derailed you, I'll let you come back in and ask your question.
Okay. So which tropes do you think, actually, I'm going to ask, JR likes to ask which tropes do you feel really you brought in from your cultural heritage into this book?
Definitely the soup. The soup is a big part of like how I grew up. And it's, in fact, we even got a text from my brother-in-law just like an hour ago. He's like, Mom made more soup. Do you guys want some? And I was like, no, I made soup today too. And he's like, but she made so much we won't be able to finish. And I think that spans many cultures, right? So it's not just like a Chinese thing. So I would say that for me, I always joke about it, how food has to make it into my writing. But Kevin J. Anderson, as an instructor, had said something really interesting. He painted a vivid picture about growing up in his town in the Midwest and what it smelled like and what people did every winter and every summer and that kind of thing. And I thought those aspects of your daily life, it may feel mundane, but it makes it easier for the reader to anchor themselves. And so I think that's why it's still important to include those types of details.
So,
yeah, I like that. That's that running joke that when you see that big metal pot on, you're going to be eating the same thing for several days. So, like, I think every culture at some level, when you go back to the more pre-modern times, so, before we all lived cramped in cities, I think all cultures have something like that. And so that's the cool thing, is you can have things that set your culture specifically in the context of the story as unique, but ties it to the larger human experience so everyone can relate to it. I think that's a neat trick to do that with food.
Yeah,
but I'm sure you just wanted to write about food.
I always just want to write about food, but later when she's part of Slayers, she's fighting back to back with non-humans too, and they are they have to find ways to connect to each other, and food can still be one of those tools, right?
Everybody's got to eat.
Or put hot sauce on it, right? If it's like inedible, isn't that like a thing, JR?
That is a thing in the Army. I've known people who've hurt themselves with hot sauce.
So I never actually liked the hot sauce. So I made bank trading the hot sauce for cigarettes. The cigarettes sometimes were worth less than the hot sauce. Because not everyone has to smoke, but everyone has to eat that crap. I mean, that food. So, Doc, we're going to have to consult our tax consultants and see if we write about food. Does that mean the food, when we go crazy, is now tax deductible? Food for thought.
That's one way to combat inflation.
Yes.
I think JR first has to start making more money.
That helps. So Doc doesn't really like this question, but I think it's informative in the age where everyone shops digitally and things are sort of grouped together by niche, that is the subgenre in the genre. Doc is old school. She likes the Barnes & Noble speculative fiction aisle, and that's good enough for her. But if you had to put it in a subgenre...
I am open and prefer a diverse thing rather than classifying everything into tiny, tiny little microcosm boxes.
Sometimes boxes help you find what you want. Because when you're moving, you can
find anything that you need, JR.
Well, I mean, boxes don't have therapy in them, but that's another story for another day. So what genre or subgenre would you consider this? Would it just be urban fantasy, or would it be something more?
It's funny. I thought of it as urban fantasy. It doesn't have dystopian elements, but when we were getting it on Amazon, they are so... you can drill down so niche that like one of the categories was vampire thriller. And I was like, wow, okay, I guess we're a vampire thriller.
I loved it. I would definitely say it's very urban fantasy, but you could also put it in a post-apoc. It has a lot of the Kate Daniels elements to it with that. From Alona Andrews series. And
we did get some reader feedback about that, which was really great, because that series is concluded, right? So it was 10 books in the main series. And now that it's done, I think if readers are still looking to scratch that itch, that maybe they can find it with us.
I did a review of it over on TikTok. I know I joined TikTok and did it. But and that's one of the things I said on it. And I like it. I love it. I think it's wonderful. So nobody realized yet that I liked the book.
Yeah. So let's talk about the story itself. So in the crowded field that is urban vampire thriller goodness, what makes your main character unique? What sets her apart? Besides the fact that she's not wearing black leather trench coat.
I think that sometimes when I read some of these other books that I really enjoy myself, they all have extreme confidence and competency, right? They're already really good at what they're doing. And Roxy isn't, right? When we started this out, we said this story for us is G.I. Jane meets Buffy, right? She doesn't know if she's good at this yet. And we wanted it to mirror, I think, that experience of uncertainty, and then knowing at the end that I belong here, right? So it was, I think, different in that space, right? I read a lot of urban fantasy. I really do love it. And the thing you usually get when you read those is that they're great at it, right? Like, meaning, Harry Dresden is already a wizard, right? He's already quite skilled. He's skilled enough to school other wizards and, train a young apprentice and all of that, right? But Roxy isn't, right? She's really just starting out. And so, but she's not going to magic wizarding school. She is trying to carve out her own place in a pretty scary and sketchy setting.
Okay. So if you want to make her unique, I'm just saying there's not a lot of top hats and bow ties in urban fantasy. Just throwing that out there. This could be a unique thing for you. Or maybe there's a reason there's not a lot of it. I don't know. So were there any secondary characters that were especially memorable to you in this story?
Yes. So unexpectedly, we became big fans of this character named Ulf, who is her partner in one of the trials. So that's not too much of a giveaway, but they come from very different backgrounds, and they do have to learn to work together to get through the last trial, and their lives depend on each other. And we found that relationship became so much more heartwarming for us. We didn't know going in that it was going to be like that. I think going in, Ken's favorite side character was Katori, the fox, right? So she's a fighter character early on that is she's fighting a cage match, and she's kind of intense. And so I think she was Ken's favorite character. And by the end, I think maybe side characters, Ulf was my favorite.
Okay, so when we post this in the show notes, dear listener, if you were so inspired to in the Facebook group, if you were so inspired to read this, you should comment on who your favorite side character was, and I will pester Julia until she looks over on the YouTubes or on the Facebooks. So does your story have any specific singular bad guy that she's facing off against without spoilers, or is it more of a man versus nature kind of struggle?
Yeah, this is like I said, this is like G.I. Jane, right? The bad guy is teased in this one, and he's revealed in book 2, right? So there's a direct face-off with the villain in book 2. But in book 1, it's really more about her personal challenges to get through this gauntlet that she has to tackle in order to become a slayer.
Okay, so speaking of characters, as authors, we put our characters through the ringer. We do lots of not very nice things to them, and we cackle with glee while we do it. So, if the main character met you in a back alley and she knew you were the arbiter of her torment, how do you see that interaction playing out?
Ooh, yeah, I think she'd be pretty unhappy with me, especially after some of these scenes that I just wrote in book 2.
Yeah. I don't think she.
So Doc, How mad do you think she would be, having read the books? I mean, we talking like rip her head off and spit down her throat kind of mad, or just maybe a gentle ass whooping?
I think there's going to be like a, hey, let's go on to the sparring match because we're gonna have some talks. And but I don't think like she definitely, as long as it wasn't the fox, she'd probably fare pretty decently. But if it was Roxy, I think it would be like, okay, we're going to have a talk, and I need you to do these things, and that can make it up for me.
So some wall-to-wall counseling.
Mercenary and being like, okay, if you want to get out of this, I need you to fix this thing. And if you can fix this thing and maybe this thing, we can probably get along with this.
I think you nailed it.
Okay.
We had a tagline for Roxy, and it was "Let's make a deal."
Yeah. So that is very Roxy. I think she'd be like, okay, we can solve this, or I can beat your ass. So, do you have a favorite archetype when you're writing?
You know, when we sold that trilogy to Tor, the archetype that we concluded with was that we were interested in the senator archetype, and that ended up being the villain. So from the hero, like the protagonist standpoint, I don't know that we thought so much about archetype, but we thought about redemption arc, right? That is actually one of my favorite character arcs, is like the redemption arc, right? Where they do something to show the world like that they really are a good person inside, right? Like mishaps aside. So it's a great question about archetypes. And I feel like for us, the archetype ended up being what we used when we were thinking about the villains.
I could see that really being the case. So I'm betting I know the answer to this, but were there any scenes that you cut in the first book and saved for later to, like, you know, that would work, but just not here? Or
Yeah, so not to give any spoilers, but there is a side adventure that that came out of book one that we wanted to start in book two, but we ended up cutting from book two. And that is an adventure with Roxy and Ulf that I had started writing. So I think at the end we had, like, you know, the epilogue and then the second epilogue. And then I was like, okay, well, I can't fit any more into book one. This will have to go into book two. And then we started writing book two. And I was like, well, it's too long now until we get to the inciting incident. So this is just going to have to be a whole side quest. Right.
You know what? Short stories are made of these.
Yes. So I think this will be like a, 2.5 kind of short story when I get done with it.
I think that sounds great. I love that, you clearly have an idea of how this series is going to progress. And I think that's great because in a world where so many things are uncertain, and other than J.R. Martin will never finish the series, I think that's probably a certainty at this point. But can you tell us a bit more about the world? I mean, we've talked.
Yeah, the world is unexpectedly large, right? So we thought after, so book one ended up being so much longer than we thought it would be. It's like 102,000 words. And I thought, okay, well, we've already established the world. This is a world where there's humans living and fighting side by side with fae and vampires, and then they're combating things like demons, and there are, of course, all these shifter pacts. But once we started delving into, okay, what are the political dynamics of these shifter pacts, right? And how does the power structure work for the pact, the thing that holds them all together? That ended up becoming a much bigger picture, and we could only show a little piece in each book, right? So one of my favorite scenes that we wrote in book two is she gets to go to the Tarim temple. These are the beings that, like, are responsible for the veil existing in the first place. So I think it's a mystery that we couldn't quite get to in book one because book one was already so big, but we got to start book two with it. So that was exciting for us because that was the reader feedback we got. is that people asked, like, how can we find out more about this world and why it's like this? And so I hope for readers that follow us into book 2 that we start answering those questions for them about why the world is the way it is there.
Well, and I like how you're doing it, because I don't, as much as I want like the entire explanation, I like kind of the teasing out and finding it as we go a lot of the time, because for one, if there's such a thing as too much info dump, and for me that can wreck the pace of the story for me.
Yeah, we're definitely action adventure oriented, so we'll always cut background in favor of more faster pacing. That's just a preference of ours in our writing.
I can get along with that.
We had pages and pages of background story that we wrote last year before even starting drafting. So,
I'm sure, because for one, it definitely feels as a fully fleshed out world. So
did you go ahead?
No, go.
You're say, did you print it with a dot? Did you print it with a dot matrix printer to give you those old time vibes when you're working with them?
No, but that would be pretty nostalgic. We did not do that.
I'm just saying, missed opportunities for swag for your audience.
Yeah,
like print that and bind it old school style.
Yeah, we were very contemporary. We stopped because we were collaborative writers. We use Google Docs. When I solo write, I use Scrivener, right? But that way, Ken and I can both be in the same document as we're outlining, and we can redline each other's stuff, and it's really helpful for collaborative writing.
Okay, so Steak and Bones is clearly part of a series. We know we've talked about that. It's part of the Seattle Slayer series. Like, what can we expect from this series arc? Is it going to be just a trilogy like the one you told, the tour? Is it going to be more ongoing like the Dresden Files or Supernatural or any of the other more contemporary urban fantasy? Like, what can we expect?
Yeah, in my mind, this is like an 8-book series, right? So because it does take time to explore the elements of the world that we wanted to share with the readers, and her own arc, the books I think cover, maybe book 1 is like a week of her life, right? Yeah. So, and then there's like a 3-month gap between book 1 and book 2. And for book 1.5, it's kind of somewhere in the middle. So I felt like we needed at least 8 books to really show a thorough arc where she's no longer a novice, right? And then she has much more of a bigger role to play in Seattle.
Okay. So we know every literary universe, at least the good ones, and you write the good ones, has their own internally consistent rules of magic, science, and or technology. Obviously, this is a magic-heavy world. So what sort of magic can we expect from this universe?
So one of my favorite things is if magic has rules. I want it to have a cost, right? And some magic systems are kind of squishy. If you've read, I think Brandon Sanderson has a wonderful essay about magic systems, like hard magic systems versus soft magic systems. And ours falls somewhere in between, right? There are consequences for using your magic, and we call it the recoil, right, effect. And so that was something it took us a while to figure out how to describe for the readers, and to show how different beings in this world navigate the magic. So that was important to us. And, we are very sincere in our world building, down to like, I had to figure out the economy. I was like, oh, okay, well, what do they use for money? Like, how does money work there? Right?
Yeah, that would be a challenge.
Yeah, and it came down to silver, because we were like, silver is like a source for how they enchant things, right? So we realized, okay, it could be extremely valuable. It's toxic to shifters. It had a lot of properties that we realized that were interesting and fed back into like, how does magic work?
Mm-hmm. So
who had more of an input on the magic side of things? Was that you with your sort of legal Socratic method learning that you did at law school, or was that more the science background that Ken brings to the table that formed that?
Sometimes it's hard to know where one starts and the other begins, but like I think early on, concept wise, I was going big on this. And so I was spending a lot of energy on the rules of this world and the rules of the magic. And Ken is for him, he said writing is like he sees a movie in his head and then he transcribes what he's seeing. So it's a different process for him, whereas I'm much more on the concept side. Like if I get all the rules down, then I can see a story after. So structurally, usually I start stuff like that, and then Ken comes in and he really fleshes it all out.
Okay. That works for me. All right, Doc, you get to ask your favorite set of questions. Well, after the fandom con
Of
stuff.
all the magic in this universe, what would you want to have now in this one?
You know what? I'm very envious of the magic of transformation. I think that for me, one of the fascinations of why I love urban fantasy is I'm really interested in like shifters, right? And so that's another reason I love Katori, right? She's a fox shifter, and I think the issue becomes like, does your thinking change? Like, are you different when you're in your animal form? I don't know. For me, that's like a fascinating thing about, are you a monster? And are you a human? What are you? I really love shifters. And so if I had to pick something from this world that I would claim for my own, I probably would want to be a shifter.
I've had those same thoughts too. Like what happens to the way they think and the way they communicate.
Right.
That's a good one.
So how would you use that? You'd have so much fun with it. What would the first thing you would do be?
I don't know. I might go hunting, right?
Well, what kind of animal would you want to shift into?
Well, something with 4 legs and something can run fast, right? So I think that we laughed about other types of shifters. There is a shark shifter in our books, and I was like, okay, I don't want to do that. I would definitely not want to be swimming in the ocean. Right? It's in my animal form.
No.
But I could see like some people who are much more at home in the water would feel like that would be fun for them.
When I first started writing, you do before you're published, do all the writing groups. And so you read lots of stuff that never sees the light of day. And one of the ladies that I worked with actually wrote a shifter story where the guy became a shifter as a curse. So this giant biker dude became like a little lap poodle when he shifted is like sort of his eternal curse. So I think you can have a lot of fun with like what you shift into and almost like bipolar from what you are as, your human form to what you become.
I mean, there is a lot of humor into it, right? Because like in books, there are always very glamorous shifters like bears and wolves and things like that. But what if you were, I don't know, a platypus? Maybe it's not very glamorous.
Yeah, that could be interesting. So yeah, they are so cute, Doc. Calm down. So your universe obviously doesn't really have aliens in it, but you do have magical creatures. So when you create these magical creatures, how did you do that? Were you inspired by your nightmares? Did you let Mother Nature inspire you? Did you pull from those Chinese folklore, myth, and legend for this series?
Definitely research. So we were looking through myth. We were combing through various kind of geographical areas to pull some different types of creatures into our world. And I think that's maybe what the fun of writing in fantasy is that you can borrow heavily from mythology.
Okay. So before we start the wrap up stuff, if somebody said, hey, I'd like to get my kid reading more, and this sounds like it's interesting, what age range would you put this story at for someone to think about giving their
I already had this question today. So amazingly, my 11-year-old has read a lot of it. It is there's no profanity in this, right? It's not steamy at all. I think it's age appropriate for kids who are already reading Rick Riordan or whatever. I mean, there are some scenes that I think could be scary, right? Because there's violence in these, but given what kids can watch in movies today, I feel like 12 and up is a pretty safe range.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously this interview is winding down, but was there anything we didn't ask you about steaks and bones? And I kept wanting to autocorrect to steak like what you eat. So that's how you know I started another diet. But so is there anything we didn't ask about Steaks and Bones in the Seattle Slayers series that you wanted to tell us?
Oh, you guys are so thorough, and you gave me ideas. You reminded me that, like, yes, I should be like having signed stock available to sell direct, because that was something that I had meant to do and like forgot. Now I'm going to talk to my website guy about getting that set up.
But hey, there's still time before Christmas.
Exactly.
Yeah, taxes get to be a pain, so you got to find ways to automate, so you have time to actually write the words.
I think Katie Cross said that, it was a little bit intimidating, but once she talked to her accountant, it all made sense and she was able to make it work. So I'm going to take that attitude too.
There you go. All right. So, dear listener, it's that time again where I remind you to please be kind and speak your mind on the reviewing platforms. Your reviews help the right readers find the right book. So do your part. And please remember that you are talking to other readers and you're telling them what you liked and what you didn't like and why. And it helps them decide. And sometimes you can have some fun discussions in the comment sections. Well, you used to be able to before Amazon shut that down, but you can still do that over on BookBub and Goodreads. And if that doesn't work for you, start a website and host your own dang reviews. But share the goodness that is the literary crack we all love to ingest directly into our veins, and do your part. It really does help everybody in this process. So as we wrap this up, Julia V, can you remind listeners how they can find you? And as usual, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yes. So I'm, on social media as www.juliav.com. I'm also on Facebook. My Twitter handle is Valley Girl. It's GRRL.
Okay. And you can find us, dear listener, at Twitter. On Twitter, it's twitter.com/SF_fantasy_show. Sierra Foxtrot _fantasy_show. You can email us at blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. I promise we answer that one. You can send all hate mail today to docseska@gmail.com. She really loves to hear you tell her how she got everything wrong. You can join us on Facebook where all the shenanigans happen, including Doc torturing me with pictures of heretical pizzas. At facebook.com/groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. Again, /groups/a Blasters and Blades podcast. We do have a Facebook page. We do not have enough followers yet to have a dedicated URL, but we've been sharing that around. So check out that page, follow it, hit the like, share with your friends. It helps us spread the good word it is the podcast and attract even more awesome guests to the show. So that would be very helpful if you could do that, dear listener. You can find our website at anchor.fm/blasters and blades. Again, anchor.fm/blasters-and-blades, where you can also help support the show for as little as 99 cents a month. You can help keep the lights on. And all of you that do that, we greatly appreciate it. You can support the show more directly at buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that it is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts, Doc Cisca and Nick Garber, duly caffeinated. They will drink until their liver explodes.
It won't explode.
That's science, Doc. It's science. I looked it up.
JR,
yeah, that's cricket sounding.
Did you look it up in the comic books again, or in an actual
That counts.
case? Oh.
Look, I want you to know I have a master's degree in science from Handwavium University.
Oh, I love you. The fact that you actually think that is a real place is always so interesting. So, thank you.
All right, bring us home, Doc.
Thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For the absentee Nick Garter, the addlebrain J.R. Handley, I'm Cisca. This was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, indulging our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, picking on JR, and all things that go boom or are sci-fi and fantasy.